In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, a genius composer vanishes with his masterpiece score on the eve of a grand opera premiere, plunging the festival into chaos. As whispers of foul play spread, the sharp-eyed Miss Marple unravels a web of envy, pride, and betrayal among a fiery conductor, a glamorous diva, a nervous manager, and a bitter rival. With time running out, she sets a cunning trap, revealing a shocking truth that restores the music, but not without exposing the dark ambitions lurking behind the curtain. Chapter 1. The Empty Rehearsal Hall. The village of St. Mary Mead, with its tidy hedgerows and thatched cottages, was not accustomed to drama beyond the occasional squabble over the vicar's sermon or the Women's Institute baking competition. Yet, as autumn painted the elms in shades of amber, a palpable excitement stirred the air. The St. Mary Mead Music Festival, a modest but cherished event, was preparing to unveil the Crimson Aria, a new opera by the enigmatic composer Elias Moreau. The opera house, a quaint Victorian structure with velvet curtains and gaslight chandeliers, stood at the heart of the village, its faded grandeur now polished, to welcome a rare moment of cultural significance. Miss Jane Marple sat by the lace-curtained window of her cottage, her nimble fingers pausing over her knitting as she observed the comings and goings. Delivery boys darted past with crates of flowers, and musicians clutching instrument cases hurried toward the opera house. Her nephew, Raymond West, an aspiring novelist with a penchant for the arts, had secured her a ticket to the premiere, insisting that Moreau's work was a revelation. Miss Marple, though no expert in music, was intrigued, not by the opera itself, but by the undercurrents of human nature that such events invariably brought to the surface. The morning was crisp, with a mist lingering over the meadows, when a sharp rap at her door interrupted her musings. It was Dolly Bantry, her friend from Chipping Cleghorn, her round face flushed with news. "Jane, have you heard? It's simply dreadful. Elias Moreau has vanished." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly, her needles resuming their steady rhythm. "Vanished, Dolly? How curious. Do tell me more." Over tea, Dolly recounted the morning's chaos. Moreau, a reclusive figure who had arrived in St. Mary Mead only weeks prior, was to oversee the final rehearsal at dawn. But when the orchestra assembled, the composer's chair was empty. His score, a meticulously handwritten manuscript said to weave melodies of haunting beauty, was missing from its locked case. The festival committee, led by the fretful Mr. Harold Grayson, had searched Moreau's rented cottage to no avail. Whispers of foul play were already rippling through the village, and the premiere, scheduled for the following evening, hung in jeopardy. Miss Marple set down her teacup, her clear blue eyes thoughtful. "A composer, you say, and his score gone, too? That is not mere carelessness, Dolly. There is intent behind this." She recalled Raymond's tales of Moreau, a man of genius but guarded, almost paranoid, about his work. His absence, coupled with the theft of his score, suggested something far more sinister than a missed rehearsal. Determined to see for herself, Miss Marple donned her best tweed coat and a hat adorned with a single rose. The walk to the opera house was short, and she arrived to find the building abuzz with tension. Stagehands muttered in corners, and the orchestra's discordant tuning added to the unease. In the foyer, she spotted Maestro Vincent Carlyle, the conductor, his dark hair disheveled as he argued with a violinist. Madame Clara Duval, the lead soprano, stood by a mirror, adjusting her scarf with a practiced air of nonchalance, though her eyes darted nervously. Mr. Grayson, the manager, hovered near the ticket booth, wringing his hands. And there, in the shadows by the stage door, was Julian Faber, a rival composer whose sullen expression caught Miss Marple's attention. She settled into a plush seat at the back of the auditorium, her knitting bag at her side, and observed. The rehearsal staggered on without Moreau, but the absence of his guiding hand was evident in the orchestra's faltering notes. Miss Marple's mind, sharp as ever, began to weave a pattern from the threads of what she saw. Carlyle's temper, Duval's calculated poise, Grayson's anxiety, and Faber's brooding silence. Each was a stitch in a tapestry of motives. People, she murmured to herself, are never quite what they seem, are they? As the rehearsal broke for lunch, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze settling on a discarded program. It listed the Crimson aria as a work of unparalleled passion. She wondered, not for the first time, how far passion might drive someone to secure such a prize, or to ensure it never reached the stage. Chapter 2. The Cast of Suspects. The interior of the St. Mary Mead Opera House, though modest by London standards, carried an air of faded elegance that Miss Jane Marple found oddly comforting. Its crimson velvet seats, worn but meticulously maintained, and the faint scent of polished wood and old roses reminded her of the village's quiet determination to hold fast to its traditions. The morning's rehearsal had dissolved into chaos, with musicians milling about and stagehands exchanging hushed speculations. Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively in the back row, her knitting needles clicking softly, observed the scene with the keen detachment of one, accustomed to unraveling the tangled threads of human behavior. The disappearance of Elias Moreau, the composer whose The Crimson aria had promised to elevate the festival to new heights, was no mere inconvenience. It was a scandal, and scandals, as Miss Marple well knew, had a way of revealing the hidden fissures in even the most polished facades. The festival committee, led by the harried Mr. Harold Grayson, had issued a statement claiming Moreau was indisposed, but the village was already abuzz with darker theories. Miss Marple's interest, however, lay not in the gossip, but in the players now gathered in the opera house, each of whom, she suspected, held a piece of the puzzle. As the musicians dispersed for lunch, Miss Marple rose, smoothing her tweed skirt, and made her way to the foyer, where the principal figures in this drama were conveniently assembled. She had a knack for being in the right place at the right time, a talent she attributed to nothing more than an understanding of human habits. People, after all, were creatures of routine, and in moments of crisis, they clung to the familiar. The foyer, with its gilded mirrors and faded posters of past performances, was the natural stage for such a gathering. First, there was Maestro Vincent Carlyle, the conductor, a man whose presence dominated the room like a storm cloud. Tall and lean, with a shock of dark hair streaked with silver, he stood near the ticket booth, gesticulating wildly as he spoke to a young violinist. His voice, rich and resonant even in anger, carried the authority of one accustomed to command. "The man's a genius, but unreliable," Carlyle was saying, his hands slicing the air. "To vanish like this, it's an insult to the orchestra, to me, to the music itself." Miss Marple noted the flush in his cheeks, the way his eyes darted as if seeking an audience for his outrage. Carlyle was a man of passion, but passion, she knew, could curdle into something far less noble. She recalled a conversation with her nephew, Raymond, who had mentioned Carlyle's fierce devotion to Moreau's work, bordering on obsession. Could such devotion have tipped into desperation if Moreau had threatened to alter the score, or worse, withdraw it entirely? Nearby, Madame Clara Duval, the lead soprano, held court by a tall window, her reflection in the glass as striking as the woman herself. She was a vision in a tailored emerald dress, her auburn hair swept into an elegant chignon, a silk scarf draped artfully over one shoulder. Her beauty was theatrical, calculated to draw every eye, and yet there was a hardness in her expression, a tightness around her mouth that suggested a woman who brooked no rivals. She was speaking to a cluster of admirers, mostly young men from the chorus, her laughter bright but brittle. "Elias is such a sensitive soul," she said, her voice carrying a hint of mockery. "Perhaps he's fled to some garret to commune with his muse." The group tittered, but Miss Marple caught the edge in her tone, the way her eyes scanned the room as if gauging her effect. Madame Duval's reputation as a diva was well earned, and Miss Marple had heard whispers of her tempestuous rehearsals with Moreau, whose complex score had reportedly strained even her prodigious talents. Was her disdain for the composer genuine, or a mask for something deeper? Mr. Harold Grayson, the festival manager, was a stark contrast to the flamboyant Carlyle and Duval. A small, bespectacled man with thinning hair and a perpetual air of anxiety, he hovered near the entrance, clutching a clipboard as if it were a lifeline. His suit was impeccably pressed, but his tie was slightly askew, a detail Miss Marple found telling. Grayson was the sort of man who thrived on order, and the chaos of Moreau's disappearance was clearly unraveling him. "We must proceed as planned," he was muttering to a committee member, a stout woman in a floral dress. "The show must go on, mustn't it?" His voice trembled, and Miss Marple wondered if his nerves stemmed from the pressure of the festival or something more personal. Grayson had been responsible for bringing Moreau to St. Mary Mead, a coup that had bolstered his standing in the village. The composer's absence threatened not only the festival, but Grayson's fragile reputation. Had he, perhaps, taken steps to protect his investment? The final figure in this quartet of suspects was Julian Faber, a composer whose own opera, The Shadowed Lyre, had been relegated to a secondary performance in the shadow of Moreau's brilliance. Faber stood apart, leaning against a pillar near the stage door, his dark eyes fixed on the floor. He was younger than Miss Marple had expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with a lean frame and a face that might have been handsome, were it not for the scowl that seemed etched into his features. His tweed jacket was well cut but slightly worn, a sign of ambition not yet matched by success. Miss Marple had heard of Faber's rivalry with Moreau, a feud that had begun years ago at a London conservatory and flared anew when Moreau's opera was chosen over Faber's. Faber's silence was as telling as Carlyle's bluster or Duval's theatrics. Envy, Miss Marple knew, was a quiet poison, one that could fester until it drove a man to desperate acts. She approached the group under the guise of inquiring about the rehearsal schedule, her demeanor as unassuming as ever. "Such a dreadful business about Mr. Moreau," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I do hope he's simply taken ill and will return soon." Her words were met with varying responses. Carlyle's scowl deepened, Duval's smile tightened, Grayson stammered an agreement, and Faber's eyes flicked up briefly before returning to the floor. Miss Marple's innocuous comment had stirred the air, and she sensed the undercurrents of unease that bound these four together. As the conversation turned to practical matters, the possibility of postponing the premiere, Miss Marple retreated to a nearby bench. Her knitting resumed. She had learned long ago that people revealed themselves most when they thought no one was watching. Carlyle excused himself to confer with the orchestra, his strides purposeful, but his shoulders tense. Duval swept out of the foyer, her admirers trailing like moths to a flame. Grayson lingered, scribbling notes on his clipboard, his movements jerky and distracted. Faber remained by the pillar, his gaze now fixed on the door through which Duval had exited. Miss Marple noted the intensity of his stare, the way his fingers clenched and unclenched at his sides. The opera house was not merely a stage for music, but a microcosm of ambition, pride, and resentment. Miss Marple's mind, sharp and disciplined, began to sort through the impressions she had gathered. Carlyle's passion for the Crimson aria was undeniable, but passion could be a motive as much as a virtue. Had he clashed with Moreau over the score's direction, perhaps pushing him to breaking point? Duval's charm was a weapon, honed to perfection, but her apparent disdain for Moreau suggested a personal grievance. Could her pride have led her to sabotage the man who challenged her talents? Grayson's anxiety hinted at a man out of his depth, but was he merely overwhelmed, or was he concealing a secret tied to Moreau's disappearance? And Faber, his quiet resentment was the most dangerous of all, for it was the kind that simmered unseen until it boiled over. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of her friend Dolly Bantry, who bustled into the foyer with a basket of scones for the committee. "Jane, you're still here," Dolly exclaimed, her cheeks pink from the autumn chill. "Have you learned anything? The village is positively buzzing with theories. Some say Moreau's run off to Paris. Others think he's been kidnapped." Miss Marple smiled faintly, accepting a scone. "Theories are like weeds, Dolly, plentiful but often without root. I prefer to observe the facts." And facts, she knew, were hidden in the smallest details. The way Carlyle's hands trembled slightly as he spoke of Moreau, the flicker of unease in Duval's eyes when the composer's name was mentioned, the nervous tick in Grayson's jaw, the coiled tension in Faber's posture. Each was a thread, and Miss Marple was adept at weaving them into a pattern. She recalled a similar incident in Saint. Mary Mead, years ago, when the vicar's wife had misplaced a valuable brooch, only for it to be found in the possession of a trusted housekeeper driven by envy. People, Miss Marple mused, were much the same, whether in a village or an opera house. Their motives, greed, pride, jealousy, were universal. As the lunch hour ended and the musicians began to trickle back into the auditorium, Miss Marple resolved to delve deeper. She would speak to each suspect in turn, not as an interrogator, but as a harmless old lady with a penchant for gossip. People, she had found, were remarkably forthcoming when they underestimated their listener. She tucked her knitting into her bag and rose, her eyes bright with purpose. The disappearance of Elias Moreau was no accident. Of that she was certain. The question was not only who had orchestrated it, but why, and what they hoped to gain from the absence of the Crimson aria. The opera house clock struck 1, its chime echoing through the foyer. Miss Marple glanced at the program still clutched in her hand, its cover emblazoned with the title of Moreau's opera in bold scarlet letters. The answer, she suspected, lay not in the music itself, but in the hearts of those who coveted its glory. Chapter 3. The Conductor's Temper. The afternoon light filtered through the tall, arched windows of the St. Mary Mead Opera House, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor of the auditorium. The orchestra had resumed its rehearsal, but the absence of Elias Moreau hung over the proceedings like a discordant note. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her unobtrusive corner, her knitting needles moving with a rhythm as steady as a metronome, watched the scene unfold with quiet intensity. The musicians, though talented, were faltering without the composer's guidance, their bows scraping unevenly across strings, their notes lacking the fire that Moreau's presence had ignited. At the podium, Maestro Vincent Carlyle wielded his baton with a ferocity that bordered on desperation, his dark eyes flashing as he exhorted the players to greater effort. Again, from the second movement, Carlyle barked, his voice cutting through the muddled strains of the crimson aria. "You're butchering it. Moreau would have your heads for this." The violinists exchanged wary glances, and a young flautist fumbled her instrument, earning a scowl from the conductor. Miss Marple noted the tension in Carlyle's frame, the way his shoulders hunched as if bearing the weight of the entire production. His passion for the opera was evident, but so was his volatility, a trait, she mused, that could either inspire greatness or ignite disaster. Miss Marple had learned from her nephew Raymond that Carlyle was a man of considerable reputation, having conducted at Covent Garden before a scandal. Something vague about a temperamental outburst had relegated him to smaller venues like St. Mary Mead. His devotion to Moreau's work was said to be absolute, almost reverential, but Miss Marple knew that such devotion could twist into possessiveness. Had Carlyle, in a moment of rage, confronted Moreau over some artistic disagreement? The thought lingered as she observed him, her needles clicking softly. The rehearsal paused, and Carlyle stormed off the podium, muttering about the orchestra's incompetence. Miss Marple seized the opportunity, gathering her knitting and making her way toward the stage, her steps slow but purposeful. She found Carlyle in the wings, pacing beside a rack of costumes, his hands raking through his silver-streaked hair. "Oh, Maestro Carlyle," she said, her voice gentle and slightly tremulous, as if she were merely a curious villager. "I do hope I'm not intruding. I was so looking forward to hearing the crimson aria in its full glory. Such a pity about Mr. Moreau." Carlyle turned, his expression softening slightly, at the sight of the elderly lady with her benign smile. "A pity?" he said, his voice sharp but not unkind. "It's a catastrophe, madam. Without Elias, this opera is a ship without a captain. The man's a genius, but—" He stopped, his jaw tightening. Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes bright with interest. "But?" she prompted, her tone as innocent as a child's. Carlyle hesitated, then let out a frustrated sigh. "He's impossible. Brilliant, yes, but stubborn. Last night we argued, nothing serious, mind you, about the tempo of the third act. He wanted it slower, more melancholic, but it was dragging the whole piece down. I told him so, and he stormed off. That was the last I saw of him." His words were clipped, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of unease in his eyes, as if he regretted revealing even that much. "An argument, you say?" Miss Marple murmured, her needles pausing briefly. "Artists are such passionate souls, aren't they? I suppose it's only natural for tempers to flare." She smiled, but her mind was racing. Carlyle's admission placed him with Moreau on the eve of his disappearance, a detail he had not shared with the festival committee. Was it a mere creative dispute, or had it escalated into something more sinister? Carlyle seemed to sense her scrutiny, for he straightened abruptly. "It was nothing out of the ordinary," he said, his tone defensive. "Elias is prone to theatrics. He's probably holed up somewhere, sulking over our disagreement, but his score—" His voice faltered, and Miss Marple noted the genuine distress in his expression. "Without it, we're lost. It's irreplaceable." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, her mind cataloging every nuance of his demeanor. Carlyle's passion for the Crimson area was undeniable, but she wondered if it extended to a desire to control it entirely. A conductor of his caliber would see the opera as a chance to cement his legacy, especially after his fall from grace in London. Had Moreau's insistence on altering the score threatened that ambition? She made a mental note to inquire further about the nature of their argument. As Carlyle excused himself to resume the rehearsal, Miss Marple lingered in the wings, her gaze sweeping the stage. A stagehand, a wiry young man with a mop of red hair, was adjusting a prop table nearby. She approached him, her smile disarming. "Such a busy day for you all," she said. "You must see everything that goes on here. Did you happen to notice Mr. Moreau last night, after his rehearsal?" The stagehand, whose name was Tom, looked surprised but pleased to be addressed. "Well, ma'am, I did see him," he said, scratching his head. "He was in the rehearsal room with the maestro. Late it was. I heard raised voices, something about the music. Mr. Moreau left in a huff, carrying his satchel. That's where he kept his score, I reckon. Didn't see where he went after that." Miss Marple thanked him, her mind turning over this new piece of information. Moreau had left the opera house with his score, which suggested it had been taken after he departed. Or had someone followed him? She glanced at Carlyle, now back at the podium, his baton slicing the air with renewed vigor. His temper was a flame that could warm or burn, and Miss Marple wondered which it had been last night. She returned to her seat, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. The orchestra launched into a passage from the Crimson aria, and despite the lack of polish, Miss Marple could sense the power of Moreau's composition, its melodies weaving a tale of longing and betrayal. It was a work that inspired devotion, but also envy, a dangerous combination. Carlyle's argument with Moreau was a thread she would need to follow, but she knew better than to focus on one suspect alone. The opera house was a stage, and its players were adept at masking their true intentions. As the rehearsal drew to a close, Miss Marple tucked her knitting into her bag and rose, her mind already plotting her next move. She would need to speak with Madame Duval, whose sharp tongue and sharper ambition made her a figure of interest. And then there was Mr. Grayson, whose nervous demeanor suggested more than mere administrative strain. As for Julian Faber, his brooding silence was a mystery in itself, one that Miss Marple was determined to unravel. The clock in the auditorium struck 3, its chime a reminder that time was slipping away. The premiere loomed, and with it, the pressure to find Elias Moreau and his score. Miss Marple adjusted her hat and stepped into the cool autumn air, her thoughts as clear and sharp as the notes of the opera she had just heard. People, she reflected, were like music, beautiful on the surface but often hiding dissonance beneath. Chapter 4. The Diva's Disdain. The St. Mary Mead Opera House, though steeped in Victorian charm, seemed to pulse with a restless energy as the afternoon waned. The rehearsal had staggered to a close, the musicians dispersing with murmurs of frustration, and the auditorium now lay quiet, save for the occasional creak of a settling floorboard. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag tucked neatly under her arm, lingered near the stage door, her sharp eyes scanning the emptying foyer. The disappearance of Elias Moreau and his score had cast a shadow over the festival, but Miss Marple's interest was fixed on the players in this unfolding drama, each of whom seemed to carry a secret as carefully as she carried her needles. Madame Clara Duval, the lead soprano, was a figure who commanded attention even in repose. Miss Marple had observed her earlier, sweeping through the foyer like a queen, her emerald dress catching the light, her auburn hair gleaming under the chandelier. Now, as the diva emerged from a side room, her scarf trailing dramatically, Miss Marple saw an opportunity. She approached with the diffident air of an elderly villager, her smile as unassuming as the tweed coat she wore. "Madame Duval," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I must say I'm quite in awe of your presence. It's such a pity about Mr. Moreau, don't you think? His opera promised to be a triumph for you." Duval turned, her green eyes appraising Miss Marple with a flicker of amusement. "A triumph, perhaps," she said, her voice rich and melodic, tinged with a faint French accent. "But Elias Moreau's music is a trial for any singer. His arias are like climbing a mountain in satin slippers, beautiful, but punishing." She gave a small, theatrical laugh, but Miss Marple noted the tightness in her smile, the way her fingers toyed with the edge of her scarf. The soprano's charm was polished, but there was a brittleness beneath it, a hint of something guarded. They stood by a tall window overlooking the village green, where festival-goers milled about, unaware of the crisis within the opera house. Miss Marple, feigning a touch of frailty, leaned lightly on her umbrella. "I've heard," she said, "that Mr. Moreau's score is quite complex. It must be a challenge, even for a voice as remarkable as yours." She paused, her eyes gentle but probing. "Did you find working with him agreeable?" Duval's expression flickered, a shadow crossing her features before she recovered her poise. "Agreeable? Elias is a genius, of course, but geniuses are rarely easy company. He was particular, always fussing over every note, every breath. He wanted perfection, but at what cost?" She waved a hand dismissively, her rings catching the light. "I told him his score was impossible for any mortal to sing. We had words, naturally, but that's the way of artists." Her tone was light, but Miss Marple caught the undercurrent of resentment, sharp as a discordant note. "Words, you say?" Miss Marple murmured, her needles clicking faintly in her bag as she shifted it. "I suppose such discussions can become heated. I do hope it wasn't too distressing." Her voice was all concern, but her mind was cataloging every nuance. Duval's quick glance away, the slight tightening of her jaw. The soprano was hiding something, Miss Marple was certain, though whether it was guilt or merely pride remained to be seen. Duval laughed again, a sound like crystal, but it rang hollow. "Distressing? Oh no, Miss Marple, is it? I've faced far worse than Elias Moreau's tantrums. Why, just last season in Milan, I dealt with a director who insisted on rewriting Verdi." She launched into an anecdote, her voice animated, but Miss Marple sensed the deflection. Duval was a performer, adept at steering conversations away from dangerous ground. Still, the old lady nodded politely, letting the soprano talk, knowing that people often revealed more in their silences than their words. As Duval's story wound down, Miss Marple seized the moment to press further. "I heard Mr. Moreau was seen leaving the opera house last night, quite late. I suppose you were long gone by then, preparing for your performance?" The question was casual, almost an afterthought, but Miss Marple's eyes were keen, watching for any telltale sign. Duval hesitated, her fingers pausing on her scarf. "Last night? Oh, I was dining with Lord Ashby, a dear friend and patron of the festival. A charming evening, though I confess I left early to rest my voice. These arias, you know, they demand everything." She smiled, but Miss Marple noted the slight falter in her composure, the way her eyes darted toward the auditorium as if seeking an escape. "Lord Ashby, how delightful," Miss Marple said, her tone warm. "I'm sure he was thrilled to have such company, and so kind of his chauffeur to see you home, I imagine." It was a gentle probe, but Duval's reaction, a quick blink, a tightening of her lips, confirmed Miss Marple's suspicion that the alibi was rehearsed. The soprano murmured something about the chauffeur's reliability and excused herself, claiming a need to review her score. Miss Marple watched her go, her mind turning over the encounter. Duval's disdain for Moreau was more than artistic frustration. It was personal, rooted in some grievance she was careful to conceal. The soprano's talent was her currency, and any threat to her spotlight, such as a composer whose demands outstripped her abilities, could provoke a fierce response. Had Duval, in a moment of pique, taken steps to ensure the Crimson aria never reached the stage? Or was her role in this drama merely that of a bystander, her pride wounded, but her hands clean? As the foyer emptied, Miss Marple made her way to a small alcove, where a bulletin board displayed festival notices. Among them was a photograph of Duval in a previous role, her face radiant under stage lights. Miss Marple studied it, recalling a similar situation in St. Mary Mead years ago, when a local actress had sabotaged a rival's costume out of jealousy. Ambition, she knew, could drive even the most poised to desperate acts. Duval's alibi with Lord Ashby would need checking, and Miss Marple resolved to speak with the chauffeur, a task she could entrust to her friend Dolly Bantry, who had a knack for coaxing gossip from unlikely sources. The clock in the foyer chimed 4, its notes echoing softly. Miss Marple adjusted her hat, her thoughts shifting to the other suspects. Maestro Carlyle's temper was a thread she had yet to fully unravel, and Mr. Grayson's nervous demeanor suggested a man with more to hide than festival logistics. As for Julian Faber, his brooding presence lingered in her mind like a minor key, subtle but persistent. Each suspect was a note in a complex score, and Miss Marple knew that only by listening closely would she uncover the melody of truth. She stepped outside, the autumn air crisp against her cheeks, and glanced back at the opera house. Its facade, with its ivy-clad walls and glowing lanterns, was a mask of serenity, much like the people within. Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. The diva's disdain was a clue, but not the whole story. The truth, she suspected, lay in the interplay of motives, hidden in the silences between the notes. Chapter 5. The Manager's Anxiety. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over St. Mary Mead, softening the edges of the village's quaint cottages and the imposing silhouette of the opera house. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old wood and wax polish, a reminder of the building's storied past. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag slung over her arm, navigated the narrow corridor leading to the manager's office, her steps measured but purposeful. The chaos of Elias Moreau's disappearance had left the festival in disarray, and Miss Marple sensed that Mr. Harold Grayson, the beleaguered manager, held a key to the mystery, whether he knew it or not. His nervous demeanor, so evident in the foyer earlier, suggested a man teetering on the edge of a secret, and Miss Marple was adept at coaxing such secrets into the light. The office door was ajar, and through the gap, Miss Marple glimpsed Grayson hunched over his desk, his spectacles glinting as he scribbled furiously on a notepad. Papers were strewn about, some bearing the festival's letterhead, others crumpled as if in frustration. She knocked lightly, her knock as gentle as her smile, and Grayson started, nearly upsetting an ink bottle. "Oh, Miss Marple," he said, his voice high and strained. "I didn't expect. Please, come in." He rose, smoothing his tie, which was still askew, and gestured to a chair piled with programs. "Forgive the mess. It's been a trying day." "Quite understandable, Mr. Grayson," Miss Marple said, settling into the chair after he hastily cleared it. "Such a dreadful business about Mr. Moreau. I imagine it's put you in a terrible position, with the premiere so near." Her tone was sympathetic, her eyes soft but watchful, noting the beads of sweat on Grayson's brow, the way his fingers twitched as he adjusted his spectacles. Grayson sank back into his chair, his shoulders sagging. "Terrible doesn't begin to cover it," he said. "The festival is my responsibility, and Moreau was our crown jewel. His opera was to put St. Mary Mead on the map, you know, not just a village affair, but something critics from London might notice." He ran a hand through his thinning hair, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "And now he's gone, and the score with him. I don't know how we'll recover." Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles clicking faintly as she drew them from her bag, more for comfort than necessity. "It must be a heavy burden," she said. "I understand you were quite close to Mr. Moreau, arranging his stay here and all. Did you find him easy to work with?" The question was delicate, posed as if it were mere curiosity, but Miss Marple's gaze was steady, searching for any flicker of unease. Grayson hesitated, his fingers drumming on the desk. "Close? Well, I suppose so, in a professional sense. Elias was reserved, kept to himself, mostly. He'd lock himself in his cottage for hours, working on that score. I'd bring him schedules or contracts, and he'd barely look up. A genius, of course, but not one for small talk." He gave a nervous laugh, but Miss Marple caught the way his eyes darted to a drawer in his desk, as if drawn by some hidden worry. "Reserved," Miss Marple murmured, her needles moving rhythmically. "And yet, such a man must have had admirers, perhaps even enemies. Did he ever mention anything troubling? A letter, perhaps, or an unexpected visitor?" She leaned forward slightly, her expression one of kindly concern, but her mind was sharp, recalling Dolly Bantry's mention of a burned letter found in Moreau's cottage. Grayson's face paled, and he fumbled with a pen, nearly dropping it. "A letter? Well, there was something, now that you mention it. A few days ago, I delivered an envelope to him. It came through the festival office, no return address. He seemed agitated when I handed it to him, but he didn't say what it was about. Later, I heard he'd burned it." His voice trembled, and he looked at Miss Marple as if seeking reassurance. "I didn't think much of it at the time. Artists, you know, they're so temperamental." Miss Marple tilted her head, her smile unwavering. Burned it? How curious. And you've no idea what it contained? She paused, letting the silence stretch, knowing that such pauses often prompted more than questions did. Grayson shook his head too quickly. None at all. I assumed it was some personal matter. Elias was private, as I said. I didn't pry. But his hands betrayed him, clenching into fists before he forced them to relax. Miss Marple noted the gesture, her mind turning over the implications. A letter with no return address, burned in haste, suggested a threat or a demand, something Moreau wished to keep hidden. Grayson's knowledge of it, however vague, placed him closer to the heart of the mystery than he might wish to admit. She shifted tack, her voice as gentle as ever. You must be under such pressure, Mr. Grayson, managing all this. I suppose you were here late last night, making sure everything was in order? It was a casual inquiry, but Miss Marple's eyes were keen, watching for any sign of evasion. Grayson blinked, his fingers adjusting his spectacles again. Last night? Oh, yes, I was here until about 9, going over the lighting cues. Then I went home. My wife can confirm that. His words were rushed, and Miss Marple sensed a rehearsed quality to them, as if he had anticipated the question. She made a mental note to verify his alibi, perhaps through Dolly, who knew Mrs. Grayson from the Women's Institute. I see, Miss Marple said, her needles pausing as she looked at him with an expression of mild surprise. And you didn't see Mr. Moreau after his argument with Maestro Carlyle? I heard they had quite a discussion. She let the comment hang, watching as Grayson's face tightened. Argument? He said, his voice rising slightly. I heard raised voices, but I didn't linger. It's not my place to interfere with artists. They're always clashing over something. He attempted a smile, but it faltered, and Miss Marple sensed his discomfort. Grayson was a man who craved order, and the disorder of Moreau's disappearance was unraveling him. But was his anxiety merely professional, or was it rooted in something more personal? Perhaps a role in the composer's vanishing. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. You've been most helpful, Mr. Grayson, she said. I do hope Mr. Moreau turns up soon. It would be such a shame for the festival to lose its star. Her words were kind, but her mind was already piecing together the fragments of what she had learned. Grayson's mention of the burned letter was significant, confirming Dolly's account, and his nervous demeanor suggested he knew more than he was willing to share. Was he a pawn in someone else's scheme, or had he acted to protect his own interests? As she left the office, Miss Marple glanced back to see Grayson slump in his chair, his head in his hands. The sight reminded her of a young man in St. Mary Mead who had once been caught pilfering from the church collection plate, driven by fear of financial ruin. Grayson's anxiety was similar, a mix of guilt and desperation, though whether it stemmed from complicity or mere incompetence remained unclear. Outside, the village was settling into the quiet of late afternoon, the festival banners fluttering in the breeze. Miss Marple paused by the opera house steps, her thoughts turning to the other suspects. Madame Duval's polished alibi warranted further scrutiny, and Maestro Carlyle's temper was a thread she could not yet untangle. As for Julian Faber, his brooding silence was a puzzle she was eager to solve. The burned letter, she suspected, was a clue that linked them all, and she resolved to examine Moreau's cottage herself, with Dolly's help, to uncover what secrets its ashes might hold. The church clock struck 5, its chime a solemn reminder of the passing hours. Miss Marple adjusted her hat, her lips curving in a faint smile. The manager's anxiety was a note in the symphony of this mystery, and she was determined to hear the entire score. Chapter 6. The Rival's Envy. The evening air in St. Mary Mead carried a chill that hinted at the coming winter, and the village's cobbled streets were bathed in the soft glow of gas lamps. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl drawn tightly about her shoulders, made her way to the Rose and Crown, the local tea shop that served as a hub of village gossip and, on this particular evening, a refuge for festival-goers seeking respite from the opera house's turmoil. The disappearance of Elias Moreau and his score had set tongues wagging, and Miss Marple knew that the hum of conversation in such a place could yield as many clues as a formal interview. Her interest, however, was fixed on one figure. Julian Faber, the rival composer whose brooding presence had caught her eye in the opera house foyer. His silence, she suspected, masked a resentment that could prove central to the mystery. The Rose and Crown was a cozy establishment, its windows fogged with warmth, its tables adorned with lace doilies and china teapots. Miss Marple entered to find the room abuzz with festival talk, villagers and visitors alike speculating about Moreau's fate. She spotted Faber at a corner table, alone, his dark head bent over a cup of tea, a notebook open before him. His tweed jacket, slightly frayed at the cuffs, and the furrow in his brow suggested a man preoccupied, perhaps by more than his own compositions. Miss Marple, with her knack for blending into any setting, ordered a pot of Earl Grey and settled at a nearby table, her knitting bag at her side. Her position afforded a clear view of Faber, and she observed him with the quiet intensity of one accustomed to reading character in the smallest gestures. Faber's pen scratched across the notebook, but his movements were erratic, as if his thoughts were elsewhere. Miss Marple noted the way. His eyes flicked toward the door each time it opened, as if expecting or dreading someone's arrival. His opera, The Shadowed Lyre, had been overshadowed by Moreau's The Crimson Aria, a fact that, according to her nephew Raymond, had rankled Faber for months. Envy, Miss Marple knew, was a subtle poison, one that could drive a man to acts he might later regret. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead years ago when a local gardener had sabotaged a rival's prize roses out of jealousy. Faber's resentment, she suspected, ran deeper, rooted in a career perpetually eclipsed by Moreau's brilliance. Determined to draw him out, Miss Marple rose and approached his table, her smile as disarming as ever. "Mr. Faber, I believe," she said, her voice soft and slightly tremulous, as if she were merely a curious old lady. "I'm Miss Marple, a great admirer of the festival. I understand you're a composer yourself. How dreadful this business with Mr. Moreau must be for you all." Faber looked up, his dark eyes narrowing briefly before softening into a guarded politeness. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low and measured. "Yes, it's a blow to the festival. Elias Moreau's work is singular, but the show must go on, as they say." He gestured to the chair opposite, and Miss Marple settled into it, her knitting needles emerging from her bag with a familiar click. "Singular, indeed," she said, her tone warm but probing. "I've heard such praise for the Crimson Aria. It must be difficult, being a composer in such a competitive field. Your own opera, The Shadowed Lyre, sounds most intriguing. I do hope we'll hear it soon." Her words were carefully chosen, designed to flatter while nudging at his pride. Faber's expression tightened, a flicker of bitterness crossing his face. "It's a fine piece, if I may say so," he replied, his fingers tightening around his pen. "But the festival committee seems to think Moreau's work is the only one worth hearing. His score is all anyone talks about. Overhyped, if you ask me. Music should speak for itself, not rely on theatrics or reputation." His voice carried a sharp edge, and Miss Marple noted the way his jaw clenched, as if holding back a torrent of grievances. "How true," she murmured, her needles moving steadily. "And yet, Mr. Moreau's disappearance must be quite a shock. I suppose you saw him often, working so closely in the same field?" She tilted her head, her eyes gentle but searching, watching for any sign of discomfort. Faber hesitated, his gaze dropping to his notebook. "Not often," he said, his tone clipped. "We crossed paths at rehearsals, but Elias kept to himself, always clutching that satchel of his, as if the score was his life's blood. I saw him last night, briefly leaving the opera house. He seemed preoccupied." He shrugged, but Miss Marple caught the slight tremor in his hand, the way his eyes avoided hers. "Last night?" she said, her voice all innocence. "How interesting. I heard he had a disagreement with Maestro Carlyle. Did you happen to notice anything unusual?" She leaned forward slightly, her expression one of kindly curiosity, but her mind was alert, piecing together the fragments of what she had learned from the stagehand, and now Faber. Faber's fingers stilled, and for a moment Miss Marple thought he might deflect. But he leaned back, his lips curling into a faint, sardonic smile. "Unusual? Only if you consider Elias's paranoia unusual. He was always muttering about his score being stolen, as if anyone would bother. I saw him storm out after his spat with Carlyle, but I didn't follow. I had my own work to attend to." His tone was dismissive, but Miss Marple sensed a calculated quality to it, as if he were measuring his words. She nodded, her smile unwavering. "Of course, you must be terribly busy with your own opera. It's such a pity the festival couldn't feature both works equally. Competition can be so trying, can't it?" Her words were gentle, but they struck a nerve, for Faber's eyes darkened, and he set his pen down with a deliberate slowness. "Competition," he said, his voice low, "is only trying when the game is rigged. Moreau had the committee eating out of his hand. Talent isn't enough anymore. You need connections, flattery, a name. I've learned that the hard way." He stopped, as if realizing he had said too much, and picked up his tea, sipping it to mask his unease. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her mind racing. Faber's bitterness was palpable, a wound that had festered long before Moreau's disappearance. His mention of seeing Moreau leave the opera house placed him at the scene, and his casual dismissal of the composer's paranoia suggested a deeper knowledge than he let on. Had Faber's envy driven him to act, perhaps to steal the score he so openly disparaged? She recalled the burned letter mentioned by Mr. Grayson, its fragments hinting at a rival's threat. Faber, with his thwarted ambitions, fit the profile all too well. She shifted the conversation, her tone as light as ever. "I do hope Mr. Moreau is found soon," she said. "His score sounds like such a treasure. I suppose you composers must guard your work closely. Have you ever had to worry about such things?" The question was innocuous, but her eyes were sharp, watching for any telltale sign. Faber's lips twitched, and he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Every composer worries, Miss Marple. A score is your soul on paper. But I don't lock mine away like Elias did. If someone wants to steal my work, they're welcome to try. It's not as if the world is clamoring for it." His words were laced with self-deprecation, but Miss Marple caught the undercurrent of defiance, as if he were daring her to probe further. She smiled, folding her knitting. "You're too modest, Mr. Faber. I'm sure your work will find its audience in time." She rose, thanking him for the chat, and made her way to the door, her mind abuzz with new insights. Faber's envy was a thread that wove through the mystery, connecting him to Moreau's disappearance in ways she could not yet fully discern. His presence at the opera house last night, his bitterness toward Moreau, and his casual mention of the composer's paranoia were all pieces of a puzzle she was determined to assemble. Outside, the village was settling into dusk, the festival banners casting long shadows across the green. Miss Marple paused, her thoughts turning to the burned letter. If Faber was involved, the letter might hold the key to his motives. She resolved to visit Moreau's cottage with Dolly Bantry, hoping to uncover more about its contents. The rival's envy, she suspected, was a melody of resentment that could lead to the heart of the mystery. The church clock chimed 6, its notes carrying over the quiet streets. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl, her lips curving in a faint smile. Faber's words had revealed more than he intended, and she was one step closer to unraveling the truth. Chapter 7. A Clue in the Ashes. The twilight settled over St. Mary Mead with a gentle hush, the village's lanterns casting a warm glow on the cobbled paths. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl drawn against the evening chill, walked arm in arm with her friend Dolly Bantry toward the modest cottage rented by Elias Moreau for the duration of the festival. The composer's disappearance, now a full day old, had deepened the unease that hung over the village, and Miss Marple's mind was a whirl of impressions gathered from her encounters with Maestro Carlyle, Madame Duval, Mr. Grayson, and Julian Faber. Each had revealed something, a temper, a disdain, an anxiety, an envy. But the burned letter mentioned by Grayson lingered in her thoughts, a tantalizing thread she was determined to unravel. Dolly, ever eager for a bit of adventure, had readily agreed to accompany Miss Marple to Moreau's cottage, her curiosity piqued by the prospect of sleuthing. "Jane, you're positively wicked, dragging me into this," she said, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "Arthur will have a fit if he finds out I've been poking around a missing man's house." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her knitting bag swinging gently at her side. "Nonsense, Dolly. We're merely paying a neighborly visit to ensure Mr. Moreau's cottage is secure. Besides, you've always had a knack for noticing what others miss." The cottage, a charming stone affair with ivy climbing its walls, stood at the edge of the village, its windows dark and unwelcoming. Miss Marple had secured permission from the festival committee through a discreet word with Mrs. Grayson, who was only too happy to oblige the dear old lady to check the premises for any signs of disturbance. The local constable, a stolid young man named Polk, had been informed, but Miss Marple preferred to conduct her investigation without his heavy-handed presence. "Policemen are very good at their duties," she had remarked to Dolly, "but they do tend to trample the subtler clues." The front door creaked open under Dolly's borrowed key, revealing a tidy but sparsely furnished interior. The air was stale, tinged with the faint scent of ink and paper, and a thin layer of dust suggested Moreau had not been home for at least a day. Miss Marple's eyes swept the room, taking in the small writing desk by the window, a single armchair, and a fireplace where a few charred scraps lay among the ashes. "There, Dolly," she said, pointing to the hearth. "That's where we'll start." Dolly, with a dramatic flourish, knelt by the fireplace, her gloves protecting her hands as she sifted through the ashes. "Really, Jane, this is like something out of one of Raymond's novels," she said, but her tone grew serious as she uncovered fragments of paper, their edges blackened but some words still legible. Miss Marple joined her, her nimble fingers carefully lifting the scraps and arranging them on a clean handkerchief. The task was delicate, requiring the patience of her needlework, and she worked in silence, her mind as focused as if she were piecing together a quilt. The fragments, though few, were revealing. One bore the word rival, scrawled in a bold hand. Another held a partial phrase, "Your score." A third, barely legible, suggested a demand. "Hand it over." Miss Marple's lips pursed as she studied the scraps, her thoughts racing. "This is no ordinary letter, Dolly," she said softly. "It's a threat, or perhaps a warning. Someone wanted Mr. Moreau's score, and they were not subtle about it." Dolly's eyes widened. "A threat? Jane, do you think someone forced him to give up the Crimson area? But who would do such a thing?" She glanced around the cottage, as if expecting the culprit to emerge from the shadows. Miss Marple did not answer immediately, her gaze fixed on the fragments. The word rival pointed unmistakably to Julian Faber, whose envy had been so evident in their tea-shop conversation. Yet she knew better than to leap to conclusions. The letter could implicate others. Maestro Carlyle, whose passion for the opera bordered on obsession, or even Madame Duval, whose disdain might mask a deeper motive. Mr. Grayson, too, had known of the letter's existence, and his anxiety suggested he was entangled in more than festival logistics. She rose, brushing ash from her gloves, and moved to the writing desk. Its surface was bare, save for a few sheets of blank music paper and an inkwell, but a drawer, slightly ajar, caught her eye. With Dolly's assistance, she eased it open, revealing a small notebook filled with Moreau's spidery handwriting. The entries were cryptic, a mix of musical notations and personal musings. One passage, dated 2 days prior, stood out. "The pressure mounts. They circle like vultures, wanting what is mine. I must protect it, or all is lost." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted. "Mr. Moreau was afraid," she said, showing the notebook to Dolly. "He felt threatened, not just by one person, but by they. This suggests more than a single enemy." She tucked the notebook into her bag, intending to study it further, and turned her attention to the rest of the cottage. A quick search revealed little else, a few clothes in a wardrobe, a half-eaten loaf of bread in the kitchen, but the absence of the score was telling. If Moreau had taken it with him, as the stagehand Tom had suggested, it had not returned with him. Dolly, ever practical, checked the windows and back door for signs of forced entry, but found none. "If someone took him, they didn't break in?" she said, her voice tinged with disappointment. "Perhaps he left willingly?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple murmured, but her mind was elsewhere, piecing together the clues. The burned letter, the notebook's cryptic warning, and Moreau's paranoia painted a picture of a man under siege, his score the prize coveted by others. She recalled a similar incident in St. Mary Mead, when a local artist had hidden a valuable painting after receiving anonymous threats. The painting had been found, but only after Miss Marple had traced the threats to a jealous colleague. History, she knew, had a way of repeating itself in human motives. As they locked the cottage and stepped into the cool night air, Dolly shivered, not entirely from the cold. "Jane, this is all rather sinister," she said. "Do you think Mr. Moreau is still alive?" Miss Marple's expression softened, but her eyes were resolute. "I hope so, Dolly, but we must assume he is, until we know otherwise. The score is the key, and whoever has it holds the answer to his fate." She glanced back at the cottage, its dark windows like unseeing eyes. The burned letter was a clue, but it was only a fragment of the truth. She would need to press further, perhaps by revisiting Faber, whose bitterness seemed to align so closely with the letter's menacing tone. The village clock struck 7, its chime echoing across the green. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl, her mind already plotting her next move. "Come, Dolly," she said. "Let's have a cup of tea at your place. I need to think, and your scones are just the thing to clear the mind." Dolly laughed, her spirits lifting. "You and your tea, Jane, but I'll wager you're closer to solving this than anyone." As they walked, Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the ashes, their faint words whispering of rivalry and greed. The truth, she knew, was there, waiting to be uncovered like a melody hidden in a complex score. Chapter 8. The Diva's Alibi. The morning sun rose over St. Mary Mead with a deceptive calm, its rays filtering through the mist that clung to the village green. The festival was now a mere day away from the scheduled premiere of the Crimson Aria, and the absence of Elias Moreau and his score cast a pall over the preparations. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her cottage window with a cup of tea, watched the early risers hurry toward the opera house, their faces etched with worry. Her own mind was a tapestry of clues, each thread Maestro Carlyle's temper, Madame Duval's disdain, Mr. Grayson's anxiety, Julian Faber's envy, and the burned letter's cryptic fragments, woven together with the precision of her knitting. The letter, with its hints of a rival's threat, had sharpened her focus, but she knew the truth required more than speculation. It demanded careful probing, and Madame Clara Duval, with her polished charm and guarded demeanor, was the next thread to unravel. Miss Marple had arranged to meet the soprano for morning tea at the Rose and Crown, under the pretense of discussing the festival's charitable efforts. Dolly Bantry, ever her enthusiastic accomplice, had secured the invitation through a mutual acquaintance on the festival committee, who was only too happy to arrange a meeting with the glamorous diva. "Clara will be delighted to chat," Dolly had assured her, though Miss Marple suspected the soprano would be less than thrilled to face her gentle but persistent questions. The tea shop was quieter than the previous evening, its tables occupied by a few locals sipping tea and nibbling scones. Madame Duval arrived, precisely on time, her entrance as theatrical as her stage performances. She wore a tailored coat of deep sapphire, her auburn hair swept beneath a stylish hat, and her smile was a practiced blend of warmth and superiority. "Miss Marple," she said, extending a gloved hand, "how charming to meet you again. I understand you're quite the pillar of the village." Miss Marple rose, her own smile as unassuming as her tweed dress. "Oh, hardly that, Madame Duval," she said, gesturing to a table set with a delicate china service. "I'm merely an old lady with a fondness for music and good company. Do sit down. I've ordered some scones. Dolly swears by them." Her tone was light, but her eyes were sharp, noting the way Duval's gaze swept the room, as if assessing her audience. They settled at the table, and Miss Marple poured the tea, her movements deliberate. "I was so taken by your presence at the Opera House yesterday," she began, passing a cup to Duval. "You must be dreadfully disappointed about Mr. Moreau's absence. I imagine it's quite a strain, preparing for such a demanding role without the composer's guidance." Duval's lips curved, but the smile did not reach her eyes. "A strain, yes," she said, stirring her tea with a delicate silver spoon. "Elias's score is a beast, beautiful, but a beast. Without him to clarify his intentions, I'm left to interpret those impossible arias myself. But I've faced worse challenges." Her voice was smooth, but Miss Marple caught the faint edge of irritation, a reminder of the soprano's earlier complaints about Moreau's demanding compositions. "How resilient you are," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking softly as she drew them from her bag. "I suppose you've had to be, with such a celebrated career. Tell me, were you able to rest after your dinner with Lord Ashby the other night? I heard it was quite the occasion." The question was posed with the innocence of village gossip, but Miss Marple's gaze was steady, watching for any flicker of unease. Duval's spoon paused mid-stir, and for a moment her composure wavered. "Lord Ashby? Oh yes, a delightful evening," she said, recovering quickly. "He's such a generous patron, always hosting these little gatherings for the festival. I left early, though. My voice needed rest. His chauffeur drove me back to my lodgings around 9, I believe." She sipped her tea, her movements deliberate, but Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her hand, the way her eyes flicked away as if avoiding scrutiny. 9 o'clock, Miss Marple murmured, as if merely confirming a detail. "How thoughtful of Lord Ashby to ensure you were looked after. I suppose the chauffeur would remember such a journey?" Her tone was all kindness, but the question was a gentle probe, designed to test the strength of Duval's alibi. Duval's smile tightened, and she set her cup down with a faint clink. "I'm sure he would," she said, her voice cool. "Though I hardly think it matters. I was nowhere near the Opera House when Elias vanished. I heard he was arguing with Maestro Carlyle. Quite the spectacle, from what the stagehands say." She leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with a hint of mischief, as if eager to shift the conversation. "Carlyle's temper is legendary, you know. I wouldn't be surprised if he drove Elias away." Miss Marple nodded, her needles moving rhythmically. "Yes, I've heard about their disagreement. Artistic differences can be so trying, can't they? But you and Mr. Moreau, did you ever have such clashes?" She tilted her head, her expression one of mild curiosity, but her mind was alert, recalling Duval's earlier disdain for the composer's impossible score. Duval laughed, a sound like a chime, but it rang hollow. "Clashes? Oh, we had our moments. Elias was so particular. Every note had to be perfect, every phrase just so. He'd hover over rehearsals, correcting my phrasing as if I were a novice. It was exasperating." She waved a hand, her rings catching the light, but Miss Marple caught the undercurrent of resentment, sharper now than in their previous encounter. "Exasperating," Miss Marple echoed, her voice soft. "I can imagine how frustrating that must be, for someone of your talent. Did you ever discuss it with him, perhaps after hours?" She leaned forward slightly, her eyes gentle but piercing, watching as Duval's fingers tightened around her napkin. "After hours? No, I kept my distance," Duval said, her tone brisk. "Elias was always locked away with that score of his, muttering about thieves and rivals. I had better things to do than chase him down for a chat." She glanced at her watch, a clear signal of impatience, and rose. "I'm afraid I must run, Miss Marple. Rehearsals wait for no one, even with Elias gone. Thank you for the tea. It was charming." Miss Marple rose as well, her smile unwavering. "Of course, Madame Duval. I do hope we'll see you shine in the crimson aria. It would be such a pity if the score were lost forever." Her words were kind, but they carried a subtle weight, and she noted the brief flicker of unease in Duval's eyes before the soprano swept out, her coat billowing like a stage curtain. As the door closed behind her, Miss Marple settled back into her chair, her mind sifting through the encounter. Duval's alibi, corroborated by Lord Ashby's chauffeur, seemed solid, but its very polish raised her suspicions. The soprano's quick deflection to Carlyle's temper, her guarded responses about Moreau, and the tremor in her hand all suggested a woman with something to hide. Miss Marple recalled a case in St. Mary Mead when a local beauty had fabricated an alibi to cover a petty theft, her story unraveling under gentle scrutiny. Duval's pride, she suspected, was both her strength and her vulnerability, and it might have driven her to act against a composer who challenged her supremacy. She made a mental note to have Dolly inquire about the chauffeur, whose testimony could confirm or crack Duval's story. In the meantime, her thoughts turned to the burned letter, its fragments pointing to a rival's threat. While Julian Faber remained the most obvious suspect, Duval's resentment could not be dismissed. Had she, perhaps, conspired with another to remove Moreau and his score, ensuring her own spotlight remained unchallenged? The tea-shop clock chimed 10, its notes a reminder of the ticking hours. Miss Marple gathered her knitting, her lips curving in a faint smile. The diva's alibi was a performance, and like any performance, it could be scrutinized for flaws. The truth, she knew, lay in the subtle cues, the hesitations, the glances, the silences, that revealed more than words ever could. Chapter 9. The Conductor's Confession. The morning of the festival's penultimate day broke with a restless energy, as if St. Mary Mead itself sensed the urgency of the approaching premiere. The opera house, its ivy-clad facade glowing in the pale sunlight, buzzed with activity as musicians and stagehands scrambled to salvage the crimson aria without its composer or score. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her cottage with a second cup of tea, reviewed her notes. Mental, of course, for she never trusted paper with her most delicate observations. The burned letter, Madame Duval's polished alibi, Mr. Grayson's nervous reticence, and Julian Faber's simmering envy formed a complex score of motives. But Maestro Vincent Carlyle's fiery temper remained a discordant note she could not ignore. His argument with Elias Moreau on the night of the composer's disappearance was a thread she needed to tug, and she resolved to confront him before the day's rehearsal began. Miss Marple arrived at the opera house just as the morning mist lifted, her tweed coat buttoned against the chill. The auditorium was a flurry of preparation, with musicians tuning their instruments and stagehands adjusting props. Carlyle stood at the podium, his tall frame taut with frustration as he barked orders at a hapless cellist. "No, no, you're flattening the phrase. Moreau would never forgive such sloppiness." His voice carried the weight of authority, but Miss Marple noted the strain in it, a crack in his usual commanding presence. The pressure of the premiere, coupled with Moreau's absence, was clearly wearing on him. She approached the stage, her knitting bag in hand, her her demeanor as unassuming as a village spinster. "Maestro Carlyle," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Might I have a word? I'm so terribly sorry to interrupt, but I've been following the festival with such interest, and this dreadful business with Mr. Moreau has me quite concerned." Carlyle turned, his dark eyes narrowing briefly before softening into a weary politeness. "Miss Marple, isn't it?" he said, stepping down from the podium. "You're Raymond West's aunt, I believe. I'm afraid I've little time for chatter. The orchestra is falling apart without Elias." He ran a hand through his silver-streaked hair, his frustration palpable. "Oh, I shan't keep you long," Miss Marple said, her smile gentle but her eyes keen. "I only wanted to say how much I admire your dedication to the Crimson area. It must be terribly difficult, carrying on without Mr. Moreau's guidance. I heard you had a disagreement with him the night he vanished. Such a pity, when you both share such a passion for the opera." Carlyle's expression tightened, and for a moment Miss Marple thought he might dismiss her. But he sighed, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of her words had pressed upon him. "You've heard about that, have you?" he said, his voice low. "Yes," we argued. "It was nothing out of the ordinary. Elias was stubborn, always tinkering with the score. I wanted the third act to soar, to build to a crescendo, but he insisted on a slower tempo, all brooding and mournful. We shouted, he stormed off. That was the last I saw of him." He paused, his eyes meeting hers, and she saw a flicker of something, guilt, perhaps, or fear. Miss Marple tilted her head, her needles clicking faintly in her bag. "How trying," she murmured. "Artists are such passionate souls, aren't they? I suppose you were both under great strain, with the premiere so close. Did he seem troubled before he left?" Her question was posed with the innocence of village gossip, but her gaze was sharp, watching for any sign of evasion. Carlyle hesitated, his fingers tightening around his baton. "Troubled? Elias was always troubled. He was paranoid, convinced someone was after his score. He'd clutch that satchel of his like it was his lifeline. That night, he was worse than usual, muttering about threats, about rivals. I told him he was being ridiculous, but he wouldn't listen. He shook his head, his voice dropping to a near whisper. I shouldn't have shouted. If I'd known it was the last time I'd see him." Miss Marple's expression softened, but her mind was racing. Carlyle's confession confirmed the stagehand's account of their argument, but his mention of Moreau's paranoia echoed the notebook she had found in the composer's cottage. The burned letter, with its fragments hinting at a rival's demand, seemed to align with Carlyle's story. Yet his distress felt genuine. Was he a man tormented by a heated moment, or was he playing a part, deflecting suspicion with a show of remorse? "You mustn't blame yourself, Maestro," she said, her tone all kindness. "These things happen, especially among those who care deeply about their work. I suppose you stayed late that night, after he left, to prepare for the rehearsal." The question was casual, but her eyes were watchful, noting the way Carlyle's jaw tightened. "I stayed a while, yes," he said, his voice steadier now. "I was going over the score, trying to make sense of his changes. Then I went home. My landlady can vouch for me." He met her gaze, his expression defiant, as if daring her to challenge him. Miss Marple nodded, her smile unwavering. "Of course. It's such a comfort to know the opera is in your capable hands, whatever happens. I do hope Mr. Moreau returns soon." She paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "Did he ever mention anything specific about these threats? A name, perhaps, or a letter?" Carlyle's eyes flickered, and for a moment she thought he might reveal more. But he shook his head. "Nothing specific, just his usual mutterings. I thought it was his nerves. Geniuses are like that, you know." He glanced at the orchestra, which was growing restless, and excused himself. "I must get back to work, Miss Marple. Thank you for your concern." As he returned to the podium, Miss Marple lingered, her thoughts turning over his words. Carlyle's confession painted him as a man caught in a moment of passion, but his quick dismissal of Moreau's fears suggested he knew more than he admitted. The composer's paranoia, coupled with the burned letter, pointed to a tangible threat, and Miss Marple wondered if Carlyle's temper had played a role in escalating it. Yet his devotion to the Crimson aria seemed genuine, making him an unlikely candidate to destroy it. Could he have been manipulated by another, perhaps someone with a colder motive? She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead when a local doctor had confessed to a heated argument with a patient, only for it to emerge that his outburst had been provoked by a third party's scheming. Carlyle, she suspected, might be a pawn in a larger game, his temper exploited to distract from the true culprit. Her thoughts drifted to Julian Faber, whose envy was a darker, quieter force, and to Madame Duval, whose alibi was too polished to be entirely trusted. The rehearsal resumed, the orchestra's strains filling the auditorium with a haunting melody that spoke of loss and longing. Miss Marple settled into a seat, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. Carlyle's confession was a note in the mystery's score, but it was not the final chord. She would need to verify his alibi, perhaps through Dolly's contacts, and press further into the letter's origins. The truth, she knew, lay in the interplay of passion and deceit, waiting to be uncovered like a melody hidden in a complex composition. The clock struck 11, its chime a solemn reminder of the dwindling hours before the premiere. Miss Marple adjusted her hat, her lips curving in a faint smile. The conductor's confession had illuminated one corner of the mystery, but the shadows remained, and she was determined to bring them to light. Chapter 10. The Manager's Mistake. The midday sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, its light filtering through the autumn leaves and casting dappled patterns on the opera house's stone facade. Inside, the atmosphere was taut, the absence of Elias Moreau and his score a wound that festered as the premiere loomed mere hours away. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag a familiar weight at her side, navigated the bustling corridors with a quiet determination. Her encounters with Maestro Carlyle, Madame Duval, and Julian Faber had woven a tapestry of motives, passion, pride, and envy. But Mr. Harold Grayson's nervous demeanor had begun to stand out as a thread too frayed to ignore. His mention of the burned letter, coupled with his palpable anxiety, suggested he was entangled in the mystery more deeply than he admitted. Miss Marple resolved to press him further, sensing that his unease might unravel a crucial piece of the puzzle. She found Grayson in his office, a cramped room cluttered with festival schedules, ticket stubs, and a teetering stack of programs. He was pacing, his spectacles slipping down his nose, his hands wringing a handkerchief as if it were a lifeline. The sight reminded Miss Marple of a curate from St. Mary Mead who had once been caught in a minor scandal over misallocated church funds, his guilt betrayed by the same restless agitation. "Mr. Grayson," she said, knocking lightly on the open door, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze. "I do hope I'm not interrupting. I thought I might check on you. Such a trying time for the festival." Grayson started, his handkerchief fluttering to the desk. "Miss Marple?" "Oh, no, not at all," he stammered, adjusting his spectacles with a trembling hand. "Please, come in. It's kind of you to think of me." He gestured to the same chair she had occupied before, now cleared of its papers, and sank into his own seat, his face pale and drawn. Miss Marple settled herself, her knitting needles emerging with their familiar click. "You must be under such strain," she said, her eyes soft but watchful. "The festival is so important to the village, and you've worked so hard to make it a success. This business with Mr. Moreau must feel like a personal blow." Her words were sympathetic, but they carried a subtle invitation to confide, one she knew anxious men like Grayson often found hard to resist. He nodded, his shoulders sagging. "It's a nightmare, Miss Marple. Elias was our star. The festival's reputation rested on the Crimson area. Without him, without the score, I'm facing ruin. The committee is furious. The patrons are demanding refunds, and His voice cracked, and he buried his face in his hands, the picture of a man overwhelmed. Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze steady. There, Mr. Grayson," she said, her tone soothing. "You mustn't despair. I'm sure Mr. Moreau will turn up, and the score with him. You mentioned that letter he burned. Such a curious thing. Have you remembered anything more about it? Even the smallest detail might help." She leaned forward slightly, her expression one of kindly concern, but her mind was sharp, recalling the fragments she and Dolly had pieced together. "Rival, your score. Hand it over." Grayson's hands dropped, and his eyes widened, a flicker of panic crossing his face. "The letter? I told you all I know. It came through the office, no return address. I gave it to Elias, and he seemed upset, but he didn't share its contents. I swear I didn't read it." His voice rose, and he glanced at the drawer where Miss Marple had noticed his earlier unease. The gesture was fleeting, but she caught it, her suspicions deepening. "Of course," she said, her smile unwavering. "I'm sure you are far too busy to pry. But it's odd, isn't it, that he burned it so quickly, almost as if he feared someone else might see it." She paused, letting the silence stretch, knowing that such pauses often prompted more than questions. Grayson's fingers twitched, and he reached for a pen, only to set it down again, his movements jerky. "I suppose he was afraid," Grayson said at last, his voice barely above a whisper. "He was always so secretive, locking his score away, checking the doors. I thought it was just his nature. Artists, you know, they're eccentric. But that letter? It rattled him. I should have asked more, but I didn't want to meddle." He looked at her, his eyes pleading for understanding, but Miss Marple saw the guilt beneath, the weight of a mistake he could not undo. She nodded, her needles resuming their rhythm. "You were being discreet, naturally," she said. "But tell me, Mr. Grayson, did you deliver any other letters to him, or notice anyone acting strangely around him? Perhaps someone who seemed too interested in his work?" Her question was gentle, but it was a probe, designed to nudge him toward revelation. Grayson's face paled further, and he swallowed hard. "Well, there was one thing," he said, his voice trembling. "A few days before the letter, I saw Mr. Faber, Julian Faber, that is, lingering near Elias's cottage. I thought he was just passing by, but he was watching the windows, almost furtive. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now—" He trailed off, his hands clenching the handkerchief again. Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly, her mind seizing on the detail. Faber's envy had been evident, but this new information placed him closer to Moreau's inner world, perhaps close enough to deliver a threat. "How curious," she said. "And you mentioned this to no one? Not even the constable?" Her tone was mild, but her eyes were sharp, noting the way Grayson flinched. "I didn't want to stir trouble," he said, his voice rising. "Julian's a composer, too, and I thought it was just professional rivalry. I never imagined. I couldn't think he'd do anything drastic." His words tumbled out, and Miss Marple saw the truth in his panic. Grayson had suspected something amiss, but had buried it under his fear of scandal. His mistake, she realized, was not one of malice, but of cowardice, a failure to act that had allowed the mystery to deepen. She rose, smoothing her skirt. "You've been most helpful, Mr. Grayson," she said. "I'm sure you did what you thought best. Let's hope Mr. Moreau is found soon, for all our sakes." Her words were kind, but her mind was racing, piecing together the implications of Grayson's revelation. Faber's presence near the cottage, combined with the letter's threatening tone, painted a picture of calculated intent. Yet she could not dismiss the possibility that Grayson's anxiety stemmed from more than inaction. Perhaps he had been coerced or manipulated by another. As she left the office, Miss Marple glanced back to see Grayson staring at his desk, his face a mask of despair. The sight reminded her of a saint, Mary Mead, shopkeeper, who had once concealed a theft to protect his reputation, only to be undone by his own guilt. Grayson's mistake, she suspected, was not the heart of the crime, but a crack through which the truth might be glimpsed. Outside, the village was alive with festival preparations, the air filled with the scent of baking from nearby stalls. Miss Marple paused, her thoughts turning to the burned letter and Faber's furtive behavior. She would need to confront him again, but carefully. For envy was a volatile motive, capable of sparking desperate acts. The clock in the village square struck noon, its chime a reminder of the fleeting hours. Miss Marple adjusted her hat, her lips curving in a faint smile. The manager's mistake had illuminated another corner of the mystery, and she was one step closer to the truth. Chapter 11. The Rival's Downfall. The afternoon sun hung heavy over St. Mary Mead, its golden light doing little to dispel the tension that gripped the village as the premiere of the Crimson Aria loomed just hours away. The opera house, with its ivy-clad walls and glowing lanterns, stood as a beacon of anticipation, but within its walls, the absence of Elias Moreau and his score was a wound that refused to heal. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag a constant companion, moved through the bustling village with a quiet resolve. The threads of the mystery, Maestro Carlyle's temper, Madame Duval's guarded alibi, Mr. Grayson's nervous mistake, and the burned letter's cryptic threat, had woven a complex pattern in her mind. But it was Julian Faber's simmering envy that now held her focus. His furtive presence near Moreau's cottage, coupled with the letter's mention of a rival, pointed to a motive too potent to ignore. Miss Marple knew that to unravel the truth, she would need to act with the precision of her needlework, and she devised a plan to draw the culprit into the open. She enlisted the help of Dolly Bantry, whose knack for spreading gossip was matched only by her loyalty. Over tea at Dolly's sprawling manor, Miss Marple outlined her strategy. "We must make it known that a copy of the Crimson Area has been found in the Opera House archives," she said, her eyes bright with purpose. "If the person who took Elias and his score believes it's within reach, they may reveal themselves. People, Dolly, are never so careless as when they think their prize is at hand." Dolly's eyes widened, her teacup pausing mid-air. "Jane, you're positively devious, but how will you know who to watch? It could be any of them. Carlyle, Duval, Grayson, or that gloomy Faber fellow." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Do you really think it's him?" Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. "I think, Dolly, that envy is a powerful spur, and Mr. Faber has more cause than most to resent Elias Moreau. But we shall see. Now, can you ensure the rumor spreads quickly? The festival committee is the perfect place to start." Dolly, ever eager for a role in Miss Marple's schemes, set to work at once, whispering to her contacts on the committee that a forgotten copy of Moreau's score had surfaced in the Opera House's dusty archives. By early evening, the rumor had taken hold, buzzing through the village like a melody carried on the wind. Miss Marple, meanwhile, coordinated with Constable Polk, a good-natured but somewhat plodding officer who trusted her instincts implicitly. "I don't pretend to understand your methods, Miss Marple," he said, scratching his head. "But I'll be there, as you say. Just don't expect me to keep up with your thinking." The trap was set for that night, in the Opera House's archive room, a cramped, shadowy space filled with shelves of old programs, sheet music, and faded costumes. Miss Marple had chosen it for its isolation, tucked away in the building's upper reaches, accessible only by a narrow staircase. She and Polk concealed themselves behind a rack of moth-eaten velvet drapes, the constable's bulk making the hiding spot a touch snug. Miss Marple, her knitting bag at her feet, waited in silence, her senses attuned to the creaks and murmurs of the old building. The clock in the auditorium struck 9, its chime muffled but clear. The opera house was nearly deserted, the evening rehearsal having ended early due to the orchestra's faltering morale. Miss Marple's heart beat steadily, her mind as calm as her needles when she worked a complex pattern. She had learned long ago that patience was the key to catching a culprit, and she was prepared to wait as long as necessary. At 9:30, a faint sound broke the silence, the soft tread of footsteps on the staircase. Miss Marple's hand tightened on her umbrella, and Polk tensed beside her, his hand resting on his truncheon. The door to the archive room creaked open, and a figure slipped inside, moving with the cautious grace of one accustomed to shadows. The dim light from a single lantern revealed Julian Faber, his lean frame taut with purpose, his dark eyes scanning the shelves. He carried a small satchel, its outline eerily similar to the one Moreau had been seen with, and Miss Marple's suspicions crystallized. Faber moved swiftly, his hands rifling through stacks of music, his movements growing frantic as he found nothing but old librettos and forgotten scores. "It must be here," he muttered, his voice low but audible in the quiet room. "They said it was here." His desperation was palpable, and Miss Marple felt a pang of pity, tempered by the certainty of his guilt. She nodded to Polk, who stepped forward, his lantern raised. "Mr. Faber," Miss Marple said, emerging from behind the drapes, her voice calm but firm. "I'm afraid there is no copy of the Crimson Aria here, but I think you know where the original is." Faber froze, his hands clutching a sheaf of papers, his face a mask of shock that quickly turned to defiance. "Miss Marple? What is this? I was only looking for some old music." His voice was sharp, but it trembled, and Miss Marple saw the panic in his eyes, the same panic she had seen in a St. Mary Mead poacher caught with a stolen pheasant. Polk stepped closer, his bulk imposing. "Best come clean, sir," he said. "We know you were near Mr. Moreau's cottage, and that letter you sent him didn't burn as well as you hoped." Faber's defiance crumbled, his shoulders slumping as he sank onto a nearby crate. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he said, his voice breaking. "I just wanted the score. Elias was always lording it over me. His genius, his success. The Shadowed Lyre was good, better than his, but no one cared. I thought if I could get the Crimson Aria, I could improve it, make it mine." He buried his face in his hands, his confession spilling out like a discordant melody. "I followed him that night, after his row with Carlyle. I lured him to a cottage I'd rented outside the village, told him I needed to discuss a collaboration. I locked him in, took the score. I didn't hurt him, I swear." Miss Marple's expression softened, but her eyes remained resolute. "And where is Mr. Moreau now, Mr. Faber?" she asked, her voice gentle but unyielding. Faber looked up, his face ashen. "He's still there, in the cottage by the river. He's alive. I gave him food, water. I just needed time to copy the score, to make it my own. I never meant for this to happen." His words were a plea, but Miss Marple saw the truth in them, the desperate act of a man consumed by envy. Polk took charge, cuffing Faber's hands with a grim efficiency. "We'll find Mr. Moreau, sir," he said, then turned to Miss Marple. "You've done it again, ma'am. I don't know how, but you've done it." Miss Marple adjusted her shawl, her lips curving in a faint smile. "It's only a matter of watching, Constable. People are much the same, whether in a village or an opera house." As Polk led Faber away, she followed, her mind already turning to the cottage by the river, where she hoped Elias Moreau would be found unharmed. The village clock struck 10, its chime a note of resolution in the night. The rival's downfall had brought the mystery closer to its end, but Miss Marple knew the final act was yet to come. Chapter 12. The Premiere Restored. The night of the premiere descended upon St. Mary Mead with a hush of anticipation, the village transformed into a stage for the long-awaited performance of the Crimson Aria. The opera house, its lanterns aglow and its facade adorned with festival banners, stood as a beacon of triumph over the turmoil of the past days. Inside, the auditorium was filled with the rustle of silk and the murmur of excited voices as patrons from the village and beyond settled into their seats. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a modest box beside her nephew Raymond West, adjusted her shawl and surveyed the scene with quiet satisfaction. The mystery of Elias Moreau's disappearance had been resolved, and the stage was set for the opera to shine, but her mind lingered on the human frailties that had nearly silenced it. The events following Julian Faber's confession had unfolded with the swift precision of a well-rehearsed score. Constable Polk, guided by Faber's directions, had found Elias Moreau in a small, isolated cottage by the river, locked in a sparsely furnished room, but unharmed, if shaken. The composer, pale and disheveled, had clutched his satchel, still containing the precious score of the Crimson Aria, and spoken of his fear that his work would be stolen. "It was Faber," he had told Polk, his voice trembling with indignation. "He wanted my opera, my legacy. He thought he could claim it as his own." The score, miraculously intact, was returned to the opera house, and Moreau, after a brief rest, insisted on overseeing the final preparations, his passion for his work undimmed by his ordeal. Miss Marple had watched from the sidelines as the festival committee rallied to restore order, their relief palpable. Mr. Harold Grayson, his anxiety eased by the recovery of both composer and score, bustled about with renewed vigor, his spectacles glinting as he coordinated last-minute details. Maestro Vincent Carlyle, his temper softened by the return of the opera he revered, threw himself into rehearsals with a fervor that inspired the orchestra. Even Madame Clara Duval, whose polished alibi had held under Dolly Bantry's discreet inquiries, seemed to shed her earlier resentment, her voice soaring in practice as she embraced the challenge of Moreau's arias. Now, as the house lights dimmed and the orchestra tuned its instruments, Miss Marple settled back, her knitting bag tucked beneath her seat. Raymond leaned over, his eyes bright with excitement. "Aunt Jane, you've outdone yourself this time," he whispered. "I heard from Dolly how you trapped that Faber chap. How do you do it? It's like something out of one of my novels." Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile, her eyes fixed on the stage as the curtain began to rise. "It's not so mysterious, Raymond," she said softly. "People are much the same, whether in a village or an opera house. They want, they fear, they hide. And if you watch closely, they tell you everything." Her words were gentle, but they carried the weight of a lifetime's observation, honed in the quiet corners of St. Mary Mead. The overture began, its haunting melody filling the auditorium with a richness that silenced the last murmurs of the crowd. Miss Marple listened, her mind reflecting on the threads she had woven to unravel the mystery. Faber's envy, fueled by years of being overshadowed, had driven him to a desperate act. But it was the burned letter, its fragments pieced together in Moreau's cottage, that had pointed her to the truth. Carlyle's temper, Duval's pride, and Grayson's anxiety had been distractions, each a note in a complex score. But Faber's quiet resentment had been the key, a melody of ambition twisted into malice. On stage, Madame Duval appeared, her sapphire gown shimmering under the lights, her voice rising in the first aria, with a clarity that sent shivers through the audience. Miss Marple noted the transformation in her performance, the way she embraced the music's challenges, with a grace that belied her earlier complaints. Carlyle, at the podium, conducted with a passion that seemed to redeem his earlier outbursts, his baton guiding the orchestra through Moreau's intricate composition. In the wings, Grayson watched, his face alight with relief, his mistake in ignoring Faber's suspicious behavior now a lesson learned. As the opera unfolded, its tale of love and betrayal mirroring the drama that had played out offstage, Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction. The score, once coveted and nearly lost, had been restored to its rightful place, and Elias Moreau, seated in a box across the auditorium, watched with a mixture of pride and exhaustion. She had spoken to him briefly before the performance, offering her condolences for his ordeal. "You're a remarkable woman, Miss Marple," he had said, his voice still hoarse. "I thought my work was lost forever." She had only smiled, deflecting his gratitude with a modest wave of her hand. The final act drew to a close, and the audience erupted in applause, a thunderous wave that shook the old opera house. Miss Marple clapped politely, her thoughts drifting to a similar triumph in St. Mary Mead, when a lost heirloom had been recovered through her quiet persistence. Raymond leaned over again, his voice awed. "Aunt Jane, you really must tell me how you knew it was Faber. Was it the letter? Or something he said?" She turned to him, her eyes twinkling in the dim light. "It was everything, my dear, and nothing in particular. A word here, a glance there, a silence where there should have been sound. People reveal themselves if you only listen." She adjusted her shawl, rising as the curtain fell for the final time. "Now, shall we join Dolly for a late supper? I believe she's promised us her famous lemon tart." As they made their way out of the opera house, the village glowed under a starlit sky, its peace restored with the music. Miss Marple glanced back at the stage, where Duval took her final bow, and felt a quiet certainty that the truth, like a well-crafted area, always found its way to the surface.